They say the dodo is the ultimate symbol of extinction, a flightless, clueless bird that was too slow to survive in a changing world. For years, we've been taught this creature vanished simply because it was dumb, fat, or easy to catch. But what if I told you that story is only half the truth? What if instead the dodo was magnificently adapted to its own environment, until certain shocking events turned its paradise into a battleground? In the next few minutes, we're uncovering the real factors that brought this bird's story to a brutal end. By the time we're done, you might just question everything you thought you knew about survival of the fittest. Long before the internet was around to spread rumors, sailors' journals and tall tales served as the world's most powerful megaphone. Early explorers who landed on Mauritius wrote about a strange, plump, fearless bird that practically begged to be caught. Those descriptions evolved into a reputation that the dodo was not just fearless, but downright stupid, incapable of even recognizing a threat when it stood right in front of them. Over time, an avalanche of misconceptions buried the real truth about the dodo's behavior and biology. But how did this myth become so widely accepted? Some historians point out that these explorers weren't exactly objective scientists taking careful notes. Hungry sailors stepping onto a remote island saw an easy meal, not a creature to be studied or understood. Their diaries were often laced with exaggerations, stories told to amuse or impress others back home. In an era when travel was dangerous and slow, sensational accounts made for the most compelling narratives. So, if the dodo was a bit too trusting, it was immediately labeled as dumb, with no nuance or deeper consideration. The reality? The dodo lived free of natural predators for thousands of years and simply never developed the defensive behaviors you'd see in birds from more competitive environments. To understand how the dodo came to be, we need to set the stage over 100 million years ago, when the supercontinent Gondwana was splitting apart. By around 140 million years back, large landmasses drifted away from Africa, creating fragments that would eventually become Madagascar and India. If you rewind Earth's plate tectonics, you'll see India once snuggled close to Madagascar, until it decided to part ways and race across the ocean at a speed that, on a geological scale, was practically a sprint. This movement produced a series of underwater mountains known as the Mascarene Plateau. A few of those submerged peaks poked above the waves, forming a cluster of isolated islands, including Mauritius. Picture Mauritius during its earliest days, a bare rock jutting out of the Indian Ocean, battered by wind and waves but otherwise untouched. Over time, seeds and plant life arrived, carried by ocean currents, gusty winds, or even hitchhiking on floating debris. With little competition and a warm, humid climate, the island quickly blossomed into a lush paradise. For a long while, these plants grew undisturbed, since almost no sizable animals had managed to make the 1,000-kilometer journey from mainland territories. Then came the birds. Birds have an advantage most mammals could only dream about: flight. It gives them a free pass to colonize new territories that other creatures find impossible to reach. And so, about 4 million years ago, a distant relative of today's pigeons landed on Mauritius. Faced with a world of abundant food and zero predators, this avian newcomer flourished. Evolution did the rest. No longer needing to travel far, these once flight-capable birds gradually lost the power of flight and put their energy into growing larger bodies and formidable beaks. In an environment free of threats, being big wasn't a problem until, of course, predators finally arrived. This evolutionary process is sometimes called island gigantism. Think of it as nature's interesting trick. When an animal has no reason to stay small or agile, as it might on a mainland full of hungry carnivores, it can grow larger, slow down its metabolism, and focus on feasting on fruit or plants. For the dodo, that meant becoming nearly a meter tall, sporting a powerful curved bill perfect for cracking open tough foods, and strolling Mauritius's forests without fear. This fearless, gentle existence was their biggest strength and would soon become their most damning weakness. Mauritius was so remote that it stayed virtually unknown to most of the world for centuries. But by the early 1500s, it started appearing on maps thanks to Arab and Portuguese sailors who stumbled upon its shores. In their brief encounters with the local fauna, they noted the unusual flightless birds that seemed strangely unafraid of human presence. Yet, serious colonization efforts didn't begin right away. Mauritius was a nice stopover for fresh water and fruit, But it wasn't until the Dutch arrived that things took a drastic turn. The Dutch are often the most infamous culprits in the dodo story, but let's break down exactly what happened. True, they definitely hunted the bird. Who wouldn't, when facing an easy source of meat that stood still long enough to be clubbed without much effort? However, some historians argue dodo meat wasn't even that appetizing, describing it as tough and bland. It wasn't the biggest factor in the bird's decline. Instead, a hidden threat came from the cargo on Dutch ships: dogs, cats, rats, and monkeys. Introduced to the island environment, these animals saw the dodo as the perfect, naive prey. Unlike the dodo, which had spent eons in predator-free isolation, these newcomers had evolved in cutthroat environments. They could smell an easy meal from miles away. Dodos were enormous compared to their pigeon ancestors, but they lacked the aggression or caution to defend themselves against cunning predators. Rat infestations were especially devastating. These small, agile rodents would sneak into dodo nests and gorge on unguarded eggs. The adult dodos, having never learned to fear mammals, found their next generation decimated before it even had a chance to hatch. And if that wasn't enough, dogs roamed the forests, sniffing out even the slightest trace of these giant birds. The irony is painful. The very fearlessness that had helped the dodo thrive for millions of years turned into a fatal weakness once humans and their menagerie set foot on the island. Mauritius, with its tropical forests, wasn't just a scenic wonderland. It held hardwood trees that could be turned into ships, buildings, and tools. Once the Dutch realized this potential, they began to strip the land. Entire swaths of forest disappeared as settlers harvested timber, cleared areas for settlements, and introduced even more non-native plants to cultivate. For an animal like the dodo, heavily reliant on thick, forested areas for nesting and protection, this spelled disaster. Invasive species and habitat destruction formed a perfect storm. The dodo's nest, typically placed on the ground under dense foliage, was suddenly out in the open. With the forest canopy shrinking, predators had fewer obstacles blocking their path to an easy meal. Rats found it even simpler to locate nests. Cats, introduced for pest control, eventually turned to hunting any bird unfortunate enough to wander into their line of sight. The combination of deforestation, novel predators, and a generally docile nature meant the dodos couldn't reproduce fast enough to replace their losses. Some accounts suggest these birds were rapidly vanishing as early as a couple of decades after the Dutch established more permanent settlements. Imagine you're a dodo, pecking at fruit on the forest floor, content in the only home you've ever known. Suddenly, day by day, that forest shrinks. You begin noticing strange four-legged creatures prowling about. One day, you turn around, and there's a dog with bared teeth. Another day, you spot small, beady-eyed rats emerging from crevices, scuttling toward unhatched eggs. The life your ancestors enjoyed for millions of years is unrecognizable in just a few short decades. By the time the Dutch fully exploited the island's resources, your species is in a tailspin from which there is no return. There's a lingering fascination with the idea that maybe, just maybe, the dodo hung on longer than official records suggest. Sightings and rumors occasionally popped up in sailors' logs or travelers' anecdotes, but these accounts are often written off as confusion with other large flightless birds, like the Réunion solitaire or the Rodrigues solitaire, different species that also face their own extinction crises. Adding to the muddle are potential errors in historical documents, linguistic mix-ups, and the tendency of sailors to spin tall tales over a pint of ale. Regardless of the exact date of extinction, one sobering truth remains. In the space of just a few generations, the dodo's population went from thriving to virtually zero. And the speed of this collapse holds a grim lesson about how vulnerable isolated ecosystems can be when invasive species and rapid habitat destruction collide. Recent advances in genomic research have allowed experts to study fragments of dodo DNA, raising the tantalizing possibility of so-called de-extinction. Could we, in theory, bring back the dodo, or at least a close facsimile, by editing the DNA of its modern-day relatives? This question has ignited heated debate. Some argue that humans have a moral responsibility to correct the wrongs of history by resurrecting species we've wiped out. Others claim it's a distraction that siphons resources away from conserving species still clinging to existence. The controversy goes deeper. Let's say scientists succeed in engineering a dodo-like bird. Where would it live? Mauritius today isn't the same pristine island that once nurtured flocks of fearless, flightless birds. Much of the original forest is gone, replaced by farms, roads, and bustling towns. Even if a new generation of dodos could be created in a lab, would they be able to survive in modern Mauritius's fragmented habitats and among the ever-present invasive predators? Questions like these ensure the dodo remains front and center in discussions about extinction, conservation, and even futuristic technology. While it's thrilling to imagine a living dodo once again waddling around an enclosure or protected reserve, the ethical and ecological complexities are mind-boggling. The bird's story has come full circle, from being a naive inhabitant of a hidden island to a potential beneficiary of cutting-edge scientific breakthroughs. So, was the dodo truly stupid and slow, doomed from the start? Or did it simply evolve for a paradise that vanished overnight thanks to human interference? When we sift through the facts, the latter explanation emerges loud and clear. The dodo was no mindless buffoon wandering around cluelessly. It was a highly specialized creature that thrived under conditions we can barely imagine, an isolated island teeming with fruit, free of predators, and stabilized by millennia of evolutionary balance. That fragile balance was shattered in just a few decades. Introduced predators took advantage of the bird's lack of fear. Settlers stripped away the forests, leaving the dodo homeless and helpless. Human journals and legends did the rest, painting it as an oddball, an evolutionary mistake, rather than the tragic victim of circumstances beyond its control. In reality, the dodo's story is a microcosm of what can happen when humanity's relentless expansion meets an ecosystem unprepared for sudden change.